Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being with us today for the Farm Foundation Forum, Global Productivity, Power Shifts, and the Future of the Global Food System. I'm Tim Brennan, Vice President of Programs and Strategic Impact here at Farm Foundation, and it's my pleasure to present today's forum. I'd also like to thank Farm Credit for their generous support in helping make this important conversation possible. Before we get into today's program, I'm going to take a few minutes to share a bit more about Farm Foundation's newest program, FarmPath. FarmPath is a free 3-year program designed to help aspiring and beginning farmers build the knowledge, connections, and confidence they need in today's agricultural system. Participants will gain practical education, exposure to experienced mentors, and access to a national network of professionals working across food and agriculture. The program goes beyond production skills to help new farmers understand the systems, markets, and decisions that will shape long-term success. If you're interested in learning more about FarmPath, we're hosting a FarmPath information session and Q&A to give a deeper dive into the program and let you ask questions to us directly. The session will take place this Thursday, tomorrow, March 12th, or Thursday, right, at 12 p.m. Central Time, and will be held virtually via Zoom. During this session, we'll walk through what FarmPath is, who it's designed for, and how it can support aspiring and beginning farmers as they explore, plan, and build viable farm businesses. Attendance is free, but registration is required, so we encourage anyone who's interested to sign up and join us. You can also scan the QR code on this slide or go to the link that's now in the chat. And now I want to take just a few more minutes to talk about Farm Foundation. We are a 501c3 nonprofit working at the intersection of agriculture and society to address the challenges that affect the entire food and ag value chain. Specifically, we're an accelerator of practical solutions for agriculture, accelerating people and ideas into action. And the 3 levers we use to accomplish this are policy, innovation, and education. Forums such as today's are just one part of our extensive program of work, which is guided by our mission to build trust and understanding at the intersection of agriculture and society, and our vision to build a future for farmers, our communities, and our world. We rely on partnerships and coalitions to fund our work and increase our impact. So if you're interested in learning more about partnering with us, I encourage you to reach out. And thank you again for being part of today's forum. As a reminder, Farm Foundation is a nonprofit. We rely on the generosity of the people and partners like you to keep programs like this thriving. Forums like this, where experts and stakeholders across agriculture share the latest insights and solutions, are only possible because of your support. If you're inspired by what you hear today, we invite you to make a gift to help us continue offering events like this at no cost to our participants. Our team will post a secure donation link in the chat, but you can also visit farmfoundation.org and click the Donate Now button at the top of the page. Farm Foundation also shares a lot about what's happening in our work and across the sector on our social media pages. Please check us out on spaces like LinkedIn and Facebook to stay up to date on our work. Before we start today's forum, here are just a last few notes. If you have questions for our panelists, and we encourage those, of course, please drop them in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, not the chat. This forum is being recorded and will be posted on our website at farmfoundation.org, as well as on our YouTube channel, and we'll send out that link following today's program. When the forum concludes, you'll also receive a brief survey. Farm Foundation appreciates your feedback and your time in completing that survey. So let's get on to today's forum. Global productivity, power shifts, and the future of the global food system. This comes at a time when forces shaping global agriculture are changing rapidly, with major implication for the world's ability to feed a growing population. We'll explore how climate change, shifting geopolitics, and evolving trade patterns are reshaping global productivity and food systems. We'll also look at where the next gains in productivity may come from, including new technologies, innovating farming practices, and strategic investments, and how growing economies are shaping that global demand. This conversation will also examine how cooperation and competition among nations influence efforts to strengthen global food security, and what these shifts mean for the United States and its role in building a more productive, resilient global food system. To help us begin this conversation, I'd like to introduce to you Jessica Agnew. Jessica is a global food systems expert dedicated to advancing equitable, resilient agri-food systems and improving nutritious food worldwide. As director of the GAP Initiative and managing editor of the Global Agricultural Productivity Report at Virginia Tech, she develops and executes strategies to drive investment and action in agricultural productivity growth to meet the world's evolving agricultural needs. In her concurrent role as Associate Director of CALS Global, she leads initiatives to internationalize the talents of faculty and students at the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. Her research focuses on innovative approaches to making nutrient-rich foods more accessible to low-income populations and strengthening the agri-food value chains through digital technologies. Welcome, Jessica.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. As the director of the GAP Initiative, it's always exciting when a forum and a topic is on productivity growth. So maybe we can go to the next slide. Great. So before we jump into talking about the geopolitics and changing trade patterns and the climate events that are shaping our productivity landscape today, I wanted to start by talking about what productivity growth is. Sometimes the word productivity can elicit the image of large swaths of monocropped corn, or the phrase that we sometimes often hear, growing more with less, which can trigger feelings of, well, don't we have enough food? Do we really need to grow more? But total factor productivity actually tells us something really interesting about our agricultural production systems. And that's not just interesting because I'm an economist. So, total factor productivity looks at the changes in how efficiently our agricultural inputs, so land, labor, materials, feed, machinery, and livestock, are transformed into output. So, if you could go to the next slide. So what we are looking at here, this difference between the blue line, so the total output growth, and the orange line, total input growth, measures total factor productivity. So this gap between these two lines here tells us something about technological innovation, practice innovation, and management innovation within the system. It's everything more that we're getting out of our inputs. And so you can think of this as improved genetics, advanced machinery that reduces labor cost. So really what we're looking at when we think about total factor productivity growth, you can still think of more with less, but I would encourage you to start thinking about it as the growth and innovation in our system, in our agricultural system. So next slide. So, what we have seen in total factor productivity growth over the last several decades is a cooling in this development of the innovation within our system, or the system-wide efficiency. So, in the early 2010s, we saw really robust growth that was matching pace with our target growth rate that we need to keep with if we're going to sustainably meet the agricultural demands on our system. So that is food, of course. And so as population continues to grow, we need to make sure that we are producing more to make sure that we are keeping pace with that population growth, as well as disrupting the status quo around food security. So making sure that food is more available and accessible. As we are evolving and innovating in our distribution systems, our production systems need to at least be keeping pace, if not exceeding, if we want to continue to address food security. What we've seen in the last decade, though, is a cooling of this total factor productivity growth. So again, we can think of that as telling us something about the innovation in our system. So either we're not keeping pace in technological innovation, or farmers aren't able to access those technologies that we have been developing. So we've had to revise our target growth rate now to make up for this shortfall that we've been experiencing in the last decade. So we really need to get to a point where we're growing at total factor productivity, or innovation in the system, at a rate of 2% per year. And right now we're averaging about 0.76%. Next slide. So this graph tells us something about where the sources of our output growth are coming from. So not only are we seeing a cooling of total factor productivity growth, but also of average annual output growth from agriculture. And so the data set that we use is actually developed by Keith Hughley, who will present right after me, and has been produced by had formerly been produced by the USDA, and you can still find that data set on the Economic Research Service website. But this measures the sort of total output from over 200 commodities. And so we've seen a decline in output growth as well. Next. So we were averaging about between 2.5%, 3% annual output growth in the early 2000s, and that's come down to under 2%. And this actually has really important implications around food prices and food security globally. Import-dependent nations need us to continue a certain pace of output growth to ensure that the food prices remain affordable. Without that output growth, you're going to start to see an increase in output prices. And so that can be good for farmers, but can also be challenging for our global food markets. Next. So another thing to note is that we're seeing more input growth being the source of our output growth. So each bar breaks down where our output growth is coming from. So again, in the early 2000s, you can see that total factor productivity growth or that technological innovation was driving the majority of our output growth. And now we're seeing more an equal split between total factor productivity growth and input intensification. So I will note that input intensification is not necessarily a bad thing or inherently unsustainable, but it can lead to practices that are unsustainable and contribute to certain kinds of environmental degradation. So that's where we really want to see input use come down and be able to capture output growth from that technological practice and management innovation within the agriculture system. Next. So where is TFP growth coming from today? So we've seen a rebalancing of power dynamics, as the title of this forum suggests. So while North America had historically been this leader in total factor productivity growth, particularly in the US, we're now seeing a shift to Northeast Asia and South Asia as key global drivers of total factor productivity growth because of the level of investment that they are currently executing on, particularly in the public ag R&D space, but also in the private sector as well. We're also seeing some modest growth in Latin America and the Caribbean, and still some minor growth in sub-Saharan Africa. While in North America, our total factor productivity growth is actually averaging below zero. So that's not what we want to see. And as you can see here, input intensification is driving the majority of our very quite modest output growth. You can see the blue dot here just above, hovering just above the 0.5% growth rate. Next slide. So, what is going on in North America? I'm going to unpack that a little bit for us this morning, and then Keith will pick up the story. So, I wanted to just hit some highlights from our 2025 GAP report, where we do a deep dive on specifically what's going on in the US. Canada has a little bit of a different story, as does Mexico. Mexico is actually averaging quite robust total factor productivity growth. So what's happening in Canada and the US is really kind of bringing that continental average down. Next slide. So in the 2025 GAP report, we look at four different technological domains that shape TFP growth. As I mentioned, and I can't emphasize this enough, if you all walk away today feeling confident that when you see TFP growth, that you think of innovation in the system, then I'll be very happy. So there's sort of four different domains or buckets of technologies that emerge as an agriculture sector is developing that contribute to this frontier. So in economics, a frontier is sort of the upper limits of what is possible. So this pink line represents the upper limits of our total factor productivity growth potential based on our technologies tools, innovation, practices, and management techniques within our system. So very early on, you can think about the Western frontier, if you will, in the U.S. As the country was being populated by immigrants coming from Europe and from other areas. We started to develop technologies that help us go into new lands. So expanding wild lands and converting it into agricultural production. And so some modest technologies emerged that help contribute to productivity growth as we're going into these new lands of production. And then you have input intensification technologies. So these are improved varieties of seeds. So input intensification, not just that we're using more inputs, but that we're starting to drive yield increases on the existing land. We're not going into new areas. And then we have the technologies that help us really optimize our efficiency. And this is where big TFP growth gains occur. It's really focusing on maximizing resource use efficiency and also farmer profitability while minimizing these environmental impacts. And one technological domain that we're seeing emerge now is this systems integration concept. So we're aware of the impacts that certain types of technologies can have on our environmental system. We also have a more advanced understanding about how agriculture sits within broader socio and ecological systems. And so we're really innovating in this space right now, thinking about how to bring these systems together and what are the tools that will help contribute to that total factor productivity growth while sitting within these systems. And so right now this is sort of a flat line, but we can start to think about how do we change, how do we invigorate TFP growth? Next. So there are four ways that we envision that we can reinvigorate TFP growth. So first is making sure that farmers can adopt the existing proven tools. So each of these lines represent the maximum of what's possible based on our current tools, but that doesn't mean that a production system or a country is at that frontier yet. And helping farmers to adopt the available set of appropriate tools for their production to achieve that productivity is going to help move them more towards that frontier. You can also push the domain frontiers outwards through research and development. Through policies and the enabling environment, you can transition to the next domain. So if you're thinking more in a region like Africa, helping them to move from input intensification more through to efficiency optimization or integration, or even just leapfrog across domains in emerging economies overall. Next slide. So let's unpack what's going on in the US now. So you can just jump right to the next slide. So in the 1980s, total factor productivity growth was quite robust in the US, and we saw a reduction in the use of capital and labor within that decade. So this is the sort of middle bar here in the middle. So I will note that there's two different data sets that we can use to look at total factor productivity growth. So the purple line represents the International Agriculture Productivity Data Set, which allows us to compare between countries. And then we also have a more detailed accounting for the US that only goes up until 2021, that data set. And so those are called the national accounts. So what we see in between 2011 and 2020 was just a slightly positive total factor productivity growth at 0.28%. If you're looking at the international productivity data set, that is going to be a slightly negative number at 0.05%. So this is for all the data nerds in the room. For the rest of us, what this data set shows is that there is a clear trend of declining total factor productivity in the US. Next. First and foremost, and I hear the hypothesis when I talk about this with folks, is that we've done what we can do from the investments that we've made in the US. We've gotten everything we can. Now we're experiencing diminishing marginal returns from these early stage tools, especially around advanced genetics and improved varieties. And that is certainly true. Many of these technologies have reached a saturation in adoption. They are coming up against biological limits. And of course, we have environmental pressures, changing climates. In the US, new pest and disease pressures are shifting. And so we are experiencing these diminishing marginal returns from early stage tools. But what this many lined graph on the left shows you is that there's also limited adoption of these later stage domain tools. So tools and technologies that have emerged out of the efficiency optimization. So we've sort of reached some stagnation around the adoption of variable rate technologies, certain types of machinery, advanced tools like grid zone soil sampling, yield monitors. And part of this is resulting because of knowledge, capital, and infrastructure barriers within the American agricultural system. Next. We also have some frictions that limit the expansion of our existing domain frontiers. And this is where Keith is going to pick up the story for us. There was a reduction in public R&D funding, which fell 30% between 2002 and 2021. There's also been shifting priorities in national funding themes, and there's a really interesting sort of analysis we dive into in the GAP report this year. For the sake of time, I'll just quickly mention that there was a significant shift in the NIFA funding priorities away from technologies that would contribute to growing total factor productivity, more towards economics and social science research. And then as we are moving to the systems integration domain, we do also have some barriers that affect that as well, including this underinvestment in research and innovation. But also we need to consider our digital infrastructure and data interoperability. Natural resource constraints are making things really tight for farmers. And so adopting new and potentially perceived risky technologies or practices is really difficult in the face of these tightening margins. There's also organizational and demographic barriers that limit the speed of adoption, such as the investment in our cooperative extension system and immature market incentives. So we talk a lot about carbon credit markets, but markets that would, for example, support biodiversity and even the regulations around carbon credit markets make it really difficult for producers to make those investments. Next. So what are the implications? So does it matter? Does the US need to continue to be a frontier leader in total factor productivity growth? There are some implications that we are seeing both for our American producers and for global markets. So the USDA's Economic Research Service actually has some really interesting work on this, looking at how reductions in output from the US affect global markets and output, and specifically around prices. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is where import-dependent nations start to suffer. And this is where the strongest linkage is between total factor productivity growth and food security. TFP growth in specialty crops will also affect the accessibility and affordability of nutrient-dense foods. We also start to run the risk of land use change. So stagnant US TFP growth has actually been found to be correlated with global land expansion in agricultural productivity, with global land expansion. And part of this comes, sort of in the next point as well around the US global competitiveness. So as other countries perceive the opportunity to compete more with the US in global markets, it drives the incentive on that land use conversion. Limiting this land use change has a direct effect on global greenhouse gas emissions. And then for our US farmers, right, there are global implications of slowing TFP growth in the US, but then there are also implications here at home. So that innovation within our system, the system-wide efficiency, allows American producers to be competitive in global markets. However, we're starting to see that shift in power dynamic. Brazil and China have been investing heavily in agricultural R&D. US exports, as a result of our lack of investment, are starting to lose price competitiveness in the market. Next, I think should be the final. Okay, so what can be done? I'm going to just quickly mention these. So Definitely reigniting investment in public R&D. If anybody wants to join the GAP initiative and advocating for this, we're doing work with our partners around this. Making sure we're closing that adoption chasm, making sure that producers at all scales of production, we're not just talking about productivity in large scale operations, but small and medium sized producers in the US as well, have access to advanced productivity enhancing tools. Making sure that we're streamlining our regulatory environment, allowing these innovations to come to market through clear, predictable regulatory pathways that also embed outcome-based risk assessment frameworks, and continuing to foster public-private collaboration. And I'm not just saying this because I come from Virginia Tech, but really leveraging the state agriculture experiment stations and our land grant universities to push out those frontiers, along with mobilizing finance mechanisms to support that translational research and make sure that it's able to be taken up by the farmers. So with that, I think that's my last slide. The next is just a link to the GAP report. If you're interested in learning more about this analysis, I would encourage you to check that out. So thank you. Thank you for your patience through my brief technical glitch there. And thank you to the Farm Foundation for having me this morning.
Thank you, Jessica. Great job. I also shared a link to the GAP report in the chat if anyone would like to access it there. And Jessica, do you have anything you'd
Great.
like to say about the 2026 GAP report before we move on?
Oh, yes. So actually this year, I can share at a high level that we will be unpacking the regenerative agriculture and soil health conversations that we're seeing right now in the agriculture sector. What does this mean around productivity? What are those connections in the short and long term around those investments? And how do we infuse science-based and critical thinking components into this dialogue to make sure that we're not just once again kind of tearing farmers in different directions, always asking them to do something new while remaining productive and profitable. And so, how do we bring a farmer-centric approach to this sort of next generation of priorities within our agriculture system? So, we'll be launching our report October 1st, likely in Alexandria, Virginia, at the Virginia Tech campus there. So, more details to follow.
Right. Thanks so much. And for those of you that don't know, we have a farm campus. Farm Foundation has a campus about 25 miles north of O'Hare Airport. And on the campus, we demonstrate 9 different types of soil health practices. So if you're ever in that area and you want to visit us, just reach out and let us know. So let's move on to our next speaker, which is Keith Fugley. Keith is the Senior Fellow for the National Center for Food and Agricultural Policy and a Chief Economist for the Food Security Leadership Council. Previously, Keith spent 25 years at the USD Economic Research Service, where he conducted research on economics of technical change and science policy for agriculture. During his career, he also served as a senior economist with USAID and the International Potato Center, the White House Council for Economic Advisors, and as consultant for the World Bank and FAO. His work evaluates constraints of agricultural growth, the impact of agricultural research on income generation, food security, and natural resource use, and methods for prioritizing research. Welcome, Keith.
Thank you, Tim. And it's a real pleasure for me to be with you this morning. And thanks for all the participants for joining us. Next slide, please. So I want to really follow up on Jessica's excellent presentation, her overview of this notion of total factor productivity as a measure of technical change and efficiency improvement in how we produce food. And this concerning trend that she identified is this slowing rate of growth of TFP at the global level. So TFP is the green part that shows that for these different decades, the TFP contribution to growth, which is the height of the whole bar, has been falling. And output growth, too, has been falling. So I want to drill down a little bit on the drivers of this TFP growth and explain and really focus on the R&D investment, what's been going on globally, and what some of the implications of that are for the future of the global food system. Next slide, please. But first, let's go back and just review what the contribution of productivity growth has been over the last several decades, actually going back to 1900 and looking at the course of the 20th century and into the 21st century. So here on this graph, I show in that black line an agricultural production index. So this is the total output, the volume of crop and livestock commodities that have been harvested from farmers' fields worldwide, and juxtapose that against world population growth, which also really took off in the 20th century. But food production and agricultural production was able to grow even faster. So that per capita food production, per capita food availability increased, people became better fed, had richer, more diverse diets. And that increase in production came from almost the same level of farmland. Cropland grew, but at a very slow rate. So we see that productivity, at least in this measure by yield per unit of cropland, really explained the ability to feed that growing population. And it was able to do it at a cheaper cost. So we can see the decline in real agricultural prices. That's the blue line over the course of the 20th century. So this is commodity prices relative to the general price level, global average price. That was in a downward trend through the 20th century. But then something happened around the turn of the millennium in which we see rising commodity prices. And that suggests rising food scarcity. And that puts at risk a lot of more people at risk of food insecurity. They can no longer afford a nutritious diet, as well as puts at risk, as Jessica mentioned, further environmental degradation. If farmers then start cutting down more forests or plowing in grasslands in order to meet that global demand for commodities. Next slide, please. So why is productivity slowing down? Well, Jessica mentioned a number of things: barriers to adoption of new technology and new innovations, perhaps environmental degradation, such as climate change or loss of soil and water and biodiversity losses could be affecting productivity. And especially this underinvestment in agricultural R&D, so that it's not keeping the pipeline of new innovations full to meet the current and emerging challenges. Next slide. And I'd like to focus on this R&D question and review briefly what's been going on in the world economy. So here's a picture of total R&D investment worldwide. And we can see that a major shift has been underway in terms of where this R&D is being done and who's doing it. So this is agricultural R&D. You can see historically the high income countries, the green line, this is the public sector R&D, was where most of the innovations and research and development was occurring. But around 2010 or so, that has really stagnated. And there's no longer been any growth. And this is in inflation adjusted dollars. On the other hand, the middle income countries, especially the large countries like China, India, Brazil, have been increasing their R&D investment and now are spending more on agricultural R&D than the high income countries. And then there's a group of low income countries, actually where food security is a big problem, where we've been seeing very little growth at all in R&D in those countries. So we have this big shift in terms of who's driving innovation in the world food economy. We also have increases in the amount of private sector R&D that's being undertaken. So here I show two graphs. The purple line is the private sector food R&D. So this is really about food processing, new food product development, new food marketing systems. This is basically innovation on what happens after the commodities leave the farm. And then there's the blue line, which is R&D by the agricultural input industry. So this is more of what's relevant for agriculture. This is R&D by the seed companies, the chemical companies, the farm machinery companies. So these are innovations that then they sell to farmers to raise their productivity. Next slide. And so we see big growth in both of those. And just to look at where some of the major players are, here's some national figures on R&D spending. This is public R&D spending. We can see, as Jessica pointed out, there's been an actual decline in inflation-adjusted dollars in the amount of agricultural R&D in the United States by about almost a third since the early 2000s, whereas China has really taken off, and now that's the blue line. They far exceed U.S. investment in agricultural R&D. The 27 countries of the European Union combined also have been increasing their R&D for agriculture somewhat. A lot of that is really focused on improving the sustainability and environmental conservation of environmental resources associated with agricultural production. India has also been growing its R&D, as well as Brazil, although Brazil has slackened off in the past few years due to some financial constraints in that country. But this has major implications for what kind of technology will be developed in the future and where that technology will be most appropriate for. Next slide, please. Let's turn now to the United States situation. For the US, agricultural TFP stagnation is contributing to a loss of international trade competitiveness. So the diagram on your left is basically showing the output trend and the input trend for US agriculture going back to 1950. And for most of that period, outputs, this is the production side, was growing at about 1.5% per year. But since around 2013, and I've extended this figure out to 2024, we have really no new growth in the amount of total output from US agriculture. Now, inputs, we can only have complete measures on that up to about 2021. That's a little bit more data intensive to measure. But as you can see, total inputs in US agriculture doesn't really change very much. In fact, it's fallen a little bit over time. So that difference between outputs and inputs is it's all coming from total factor productivity. So that stagnation in output growth is because TFP growth has stagnated. And what this has meant is that the United States has actually transitioned from being a net food exporter of agricultural products to a net importer of food and agricultural products. And so that's the graph on the right. The blue line shows our total US exports of agricultural commodities. And that historically has always been positive. We've been exporting more than we've been importing. We've been a net contributor to meeting global food demands. But that surplus started to shrink around 2014, 2015. By 2019, it had gone to zero. And since 2022, we've been a significant net importer of food from other countries. So that's a consequence of stagnant output. Now, there's other things that are also contributing to this. It's not only about productivity growth, it has to do with exchange rates and price movements, but certainly this TFP stagnation is a contributing factor. Next slide, please. So let's look at the R&D investment scenario in a little bit more detail on what's been going on in the US. We've had this slowdown in public R&D. Now, about 70% of that money comes from the federal government, and the other 30% comes from state legislatures allocating money to their state universities for agricultural research, as well as non-government sources, say the private sector contributing money to, or private foundations or even individuals contributing money for agricultural research, primarily at universities. Those universities, though, perform about 70% of the public ag research in the United States, the other 30% by USDA research agencies. So that funding has come down about a third between 22 and 2021. Now, I don't have complete numbers beyond 2021 because I don't know, we don't have full data on what states and non-government sources have been, but we know that there was a bit of recovery in federal funding for agricultural research between 2021 and 2025, maybe about a 5% increase in inflation-adjusted dollars. But then in 2025, because of the efforts of the current administration to reduce the size of the federal workforce, the number of staff at the USDA research agencies fell by 24%. So overall, I think we've seen further reduction in the amount of public ag R&D since 2021. Next slide, please. Now, if we add in the private sector, we do see the private sector has been increasing its investment in agricultural R&D in the United States. These data are also not very current, though. They're more difficult to obtain, and our numbers only go to, they're about 10 years out of date already. But at least up to that point, we were seeing growth both in, now the purple line is the combined amount of the food R&D plus the agricultural R&D. I've focused that green line is just sort of the ag-related R&D by those input industries, the seed companies, the chemical companies, farm machinery, animal health, and so forth. And it looks like the increase, especially since 2000 in private R&D, kind of offset the decline in public R&D. But it's important to note that these two sectors really do different things. They're not really substitutes for one another. They're more complementary. And let's go into that in a little bit more detail. Please, next slide, please, to show what kinds of R&D these sectors undertake. So these are kind of the public R&D and private agri-food R&D portfolios. They're from different years, but the portfolios don't change all that much, at least in recent years. So if we look at the public sector, we have about a third of it is focused on crop improvement. Livestock is another big section, as well as, and then there's a little bit on ag engineering. And then there's a lot around environmental resource management, a lot on soil and water management, which has direct application to farming, but also there's forestry research and research on the proper management of other environmental resources. There's some socioeconomic and policy research, and then there's food R&D, and that's mostly around food safety and food nutrition. Now, if we look at the private sector, that's about evenly split between what's food R&D, a lot new food product development, and then what's agricultural R&D. And a lot of that, or most of that, is focused on crops. We have chemical R&D, which is really focused on developing new pesticides for agriculture. And then there's crop breeding and crop genetics. And a lot of that has been focused on developing improved genetically modified crops. So it's really focused on corn and soybeans and those crops that use genetically engineered varieties. Farm machinery and precision ag is a part of farm machinery here, has also been an important and growing area for private sector R&D. The other thing, though, is that this public R&D is really focused, a lot of it is focused on more fundamental sciences, whereas the private R&D is more on applied and technology development. So they interact this way. Next slide, please. They complement each other in this way. And these advances in the fundamental sciences by public R&D open up new opportunities for technology development by the private sector. And there's actually been a lot of activity in how to make these sectors integrate better so that these technologies and technology and science gets transferred quickly and gets commercialized. And a lot of federal legislation dating back to the 1980s and 1990s created conditions for patent licensing, cooperative research and development agreements, material transfer research agreements, research consortia, and so forth. So there's a lot of interaction to make sure that that science flows into technology that then gets used by farmers. And in the 2014 Farm Bill, Congress created the Foundation for Food and Ag Research, FFAR, which is a non-government body, but it gets some federal money. Congress puts a few $100 million into it, usually every farm bill. And then they are required to match that money with private sector or non-government money to fund research projects of joint interest. So that's been a very successful undertaking, and that really ensures that those research projects, which are carried out mostly at universities, are really meeting a key industry demand and farm demand for that matter. And what we found is our economic studies have found that public R&D The returns to the U.S. economy have been very favorable. It's probably generating about $20 in benefits for every dollar that's been invested in it. And these benefits tend to be shared very widely. It's not only improving farm income, but especially it those benefits often go to consumers in terms of it helps keep the food prices down. So when productivity goes up, farmers are able to reduce their unit costs of production, and some of that gets translated into lower food prices for consumers. The private returns to R&D are not going to be 20 to 1 because the companies are only able to capture a portion of the value of the productivity gains through the prices that they charge to farmers for their inputs. So we have this pattern of declining public R&D investment, contributing to a stagnation in productivity growth, and also meaning less competitiveness U.S. agriculture. And these forces play out over decades. These are long-term. These are long-term trends. So my last slide is just to give a brief summary of my main points. Is that we have this slowdown in productivity both globally and in the United States, and this can raise food prices and increase pressure on the use of natural resources in agriculture. Agricultural R&D has given us a high return on investment and can sustain that growth in productivity, keep food prices affordable, as well as prevent the degradation of these natural resources. Globally, we see this big shift occurring in terms of where this R&D is being done and who's doing it. And that has, I think, big implications for what Tim calls food power and the future of the global food system. And the United States in particular, R&D by the public sector has fallen, while by the private sector it has grown. But we need to keep into mind that these are complementary sources of innovation. They're not substitutes, and that this decline in public R&D can put at risk productivity and the competitiveness of U.S. agriculture. Back to you, Tim. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Keith. Our final speaker is Michaela Mooney. She is a passionate advocate and investor in agritech innovation, currently serving as a partner in Ag Startup Engine, a venture capital initiative dedicated to supporting agricultural-focused startups. With deep roots in Iowa farming, Michaela began her journey at Iowa State University, founding a food tech startup that created solar-powered food preservation solutions for smallholder farmers. Transitioning into venture capital during the global shifts of COVID-19, Michaela spent 3 years gaining expertise in investment strategies before reconnecting with her agricultural foundations. Now she empowers emerging agritech entrepreneurs by providing early-stage investment, strategic guidance, and critical industry connections. I'm happy to share also that Michaela is a 2025 Farm Foundation Young Agri-Food Leader. So Michaela, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. Excited to be here. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So while Jessica and Keith walked us through where agriculture productivity stands, and some of the underlying research on what R&D looks like, I want to take a different lens and talk a little bit more about the capital side of this same problem. So where is private investment flowing, where it isn't, and what some of the different models look like to actually bring this technology to market. So next slide, please. So I think the kind of resounding narrative that's out there is that in the past couple of years, we've seen venture capital walk away from ag tech. And the reality is a little bit more nuanced. While we had this massive run up during COVID in 2021, where there was a plethora of capital available, over the last couple of years, we've seen that decrease from $51 billion down to $16 billion. The number of new funds that are launching to support early ag tech innovation has decreased from 49 down to 17. And overall, only about 1% of all global venture capital actually goes into food and ag tech. But what we're really seeing is that in today's market, capital is just getting more selective. It's not necessarily absent, and there are still people investing in new innovation and technology, but we're seeing investors making fewer bets, writing bigger checks, and wanting to invest in things that are slightly more de-risked. They want to have some sort of proof of commercial concept and some early commercialization traction. And so it's not that capital has disappeared, it's just where is it actually getting invested? Next slide, please. So part of the reason I think we see this disconnect between venture capital and agriculture is that agriculture doesn't fit the standard venture model. And there's some structural differences that really play into effect here. So when you think about the traditional venture model, it's investors raising capital from people who are wanting to make outsized returns. They're putting money into a bucket, and the premise is, in for 7 to 10 years, I'm going to see a multiple on my money back. We're investing in companies that can go from 0 to 100 very quickly. The models can be proven and then expanded rapidly. It's very low cost to set things up with high margins and move fast and break things. But agriculture doesn't operate on that same premise. And oftentimes we see from technology to go from idea to commercial traction, it's a 10 to 15-year adoption. And a lot of that is driven by the cyclical nature of agriculture, the necessary need to have validation across multiple years, and this region specificness that comes with agriculture. What works in Iowa on a 500-acre cornfield isn't going to work in California in specialty crop vineyards. And often we see agriculture tends to be capital intense just because of the slow timeline. There's often hardware components, and farmers need an ROI. When you're talking about putting new technology on something that's your livelihood, your land, your future, you're a little bit more hesitant to take risks, and rightfully so. Next slide, please. And so, as Keith had talked about, we've seen this decline in public R&D, but we've also seen this decline in venture pullback. And even though we've seen an increase in private agri-food investment, that's not necessarily large corporates investing in venture capital or investing in early stage startups. I think what we're seeing is often that tends to be internal innovation. And so I think this is creating this mismatch where both sides of the table kind of think it's the other person's responsibility to bring this new technology to market. But if both of them are pulling back, we've got this productivity gap. And so really what I think it looks like is it's not how do we bring more capital to the table from the existing buckets we're playing out of, but how do we think about structuring capital in a different manner or using different mechanisms that will allow us to really bring this technology to market. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about productivity increase and bringing new technology to market, oftentimes we're seeing that it starts at university research, whether that's students working on new technology, whether that's PhD students, faculty in the lab, and then they have to get it all the way through commercialization. Oftentimes that involves raising some capital, whether it's non-dilutive or from investors. And honestly, most of that innovation dies in what we call the valley of death. University research ends, there's promising ideas, maybe a prototype, early validation, but oftentimes it's too early for institutional venture capitalists to play in, and it's not de-risked enough to invest in. And so because the structures don't exist to carry it to commercial viability, we're seeing a lot of companies end up in this valley of death where they're not being able to move this technology forward. And it's often a timeline that's needed that doesn't fit the standard VC model. And so at Ag Startup Engine, we play in the very earliest stages of this valley of death. And we've got a slightly different model that I think is worth diving into and expanding with this group to talk about how we help founders move that innovation forward. So next slide, please. So at Ag Startup Engine, we started back in 2017. So we've been doing this for almost 10 years now. And when we started, the venture capital ecosystem in Iowa was nascent. And today it's gotten a little bit better, but it still has a long ways to go compared to what we see in Silicon Valley or even on the East Coast in New York. And so our idea was, how do we bring a little bit of capital together and support some of these technologies coming out of the university. But more than just capital, how do we surround them with people who can really roll up their sleeves and help them take it from idea to prototype to commercial viability? And so fundamentally, we launched Ag Startup Engine with farmers at the table. So all of the capital that we raise from our fund, it all comes from farmers, producers, family-owned ag companies. So it was very much a grassroots approach to putting together a venture fund where none of the investors that are part of the ecosystem are institutional professional investors. This is not what they do every day, but it's farmers who are looking to solve a problem in their field or livestock producers who need new technology in their barn. And so that makes a difference in terms of how we evaluate technology, how we look at it, and how we can help the founders after we invest in them. We've got a group of people who will pick up a phone call, provide that expertise, open up a field, do a demo, do a trial, and really help accelerate towards commercialization from day one. The second thing is we've been very closely tied into the university ecosystem. We know a lot of the new technologies being designed to move the industry forward are coming out of universities, whether it's in the lab, whether it's students working on new innovation. And so being able to see all of that technology before it has the chance to die in the lab, we're able to work with founders, help them understand what is needed to go from idea to prototype to raising capital. What does that actually look like? And is that a risk that you want to take, or how do we help you accelerate that? And thirdly, I think what's most important is because all of our investors come from the industry, it's been very patient capital. So instead of, your expectations of seeing an exit in 3 to 5 years, we have much more realistic timelines when it comes to what's real in agriculture and building durable businesses that solve true problems. So operating on a 10 to 15-year time horizon, and then being creative and willing to structure capital in a way that meets how agriculture innovation is actually needed for that specific founder. And I'll dive into that a little bit detail later on, but just being open to being creative in how we structure investing in new technologies. Next slide, please. So I just want to touch on a couple of lessons we've learned over the last 10 years of building Ag Startup Engine. We've looked at over 1,000 plus companies developing new technologies. We've ultimately invested in 48 companies, and I think they all have a direct implication on how we should be thinking about innovation, capital, and agriculture. So first and foremost, full-time founders move 10 times faster than someone who's just doing this part-time. And I think when we think about how do we get innovation out of the university, this is probably the one of the most critical things. How do we think about convincing faculty members who are on a tenure track to leave that position and jump into something that's way riskier, but potentially has way more upside? Or if it's a student entrepreneur working on a new business, how do we give them that validity to go back to mom and dad and say, I'm going to work on this new technology and bringing this new product to market instead of taking a job with corporate America? And so whatever we can do as a community to support these early stage founders, and that's kind of the role Ag Startup Engine plays, is providing a little bit of capital and that validity that what you're working on matters, allowing them to keep moving forward. Second, and I've already kind of talked about this, but customers are needed to validate the market. The importance of having farmers and producers, the ones who are actually going to be using the technology around the table as founders are building, making improvements on the product, is so critical. I think oftentimes it's easy for founders or inventors working on new things to get swept up in whether it's pitch competitions or SBIR grants and going after non-dilutive funding, that those review panels or those judges are ultimately the ones that make or break whether you're building something that's impactful. And it's important that they realize that those opinions hold validity, but they're not the ones that are actually using the technology. So getting real users, real field data, and avoiding some of those perhaps opinions that are not going to move the business forward is really important as we think about how do we bring new technology to market. Third, I think the network is just as valuable as the capital. Oftentimes, founders really need someone who's willing to open up a customer door, open up a field or a barn to give them that perspective on how do they actually need to build this, not the $500,000 or $1 million they're trying to raise to fund growth. And so being able to surround founders with a network of people who can really provide that expertise has been critical, more so than I think capital alone. Fourth, government relations is a startup function. What we've found is founders who don't treat government relations as something they need to do from day one, understanding that regulatory pathways, USDA funding cycles, trade policy, all of these impact timelines and viability of what they're building. If they're not thinking about that from day one, then they're structurally at a disadvantage. You need to understand how all of these macro climate or macro influences impact what you're building. And lastly, having creative funding models is critical as we think about how do we drive productivity and bring new technologies to market. So traditionally, venture investors are investing capital in exchange for equity into these companies. And sometimes that makes sense, but being able to be creative in terms of what instruments you're using, whether it's revenue-based financing, whether it's repayment that scales with revenue, whether that's milestone or just non-dilutive capital, that's grant funding or funding field trials. I think all of us need to think about how do we build out a system and a structure that really supports what these founders need, not just what has been done in the past. Next slide, please. So as we look on kind of where agriculture has come from, there's a lot of trends that have happened over the last decade or so or the last few decades of building within agriculture. And I think it gives us insights into where agriculture is going. So Jessica talked a little bit about this, but we've seen kind of these tranches of new innovation that have come that have driven productivity, whether it's GPS guidance and precision in the early 90s, where early adopters can build yield advantages and cost structures that late movers over a decade later spend time catching up to. We then had variable rate technology and drones and satellite imagery that have moved from novelty to standard practices in a single generation. And I think every wave follows this same arc where you've got skepticism, then early adopter advantage, and then rapid normalization. And when we think about what does it take to bring these new technologies to market, ultimately this is where early investors and private capital and public R&D plays a role, is how do we fund that early technology in the bucket of skepticism and really give them the tools they need to get to kind of that early adopter advantage and then rapid normalization. And so I think as we think about where we're going and what's next and what's driving productivity, AI and automation is really going to be the next wave. And what's different about the waves in the past is that this is moving faster than it has before. The competitive gap isn't happening over years or decades, but it's moving in a matter of months and weeks with where AI technology is going. And I'll spend a little bit more time diving into that later. But I want to talk a little bit first about where we're seeing some of these productivity gains coming from. So next slide, please. So Jessica had talked about the 4 technical domains that are driving total productivity growth. And I would break it down into these 3 buckets, and they kind of closely tie into what she was talking about. So foundational science, think your genetics, animal health, soil research, life sciences more broadly. These are things that are long timelines but have compounding effects. They require patient capital and regulatory clarity. These are the things that would be in that input intensification domain that's driving productivity. And so I think this is where some of the most important science is happening. We're seeing founders that are working on new traits, new inputs that are dealing with the environmental impacts, whether it's heat, frost, different traits and genetics. And so this is critical, but it's often the bucket where I think investors tend to pull back because it's a little bit more complex, longer timelines. It's something that doesn't fit perhaps kind of a more traditional venture lens. Second, we have system level efficiencies. So this would be optimization, data interoperability, automation, labor solutions. So this would be all of the efficiency optimizations that are driving productivity growth. And this is where we see a lot of investor activity because the business models make sense. A lot of it has a software component. The timelines are shorter and it's needed in order to move things forward. And thirdly, I think what we need to think about is this practical change and adoption bucket. And I think this is probably the one that's the most overlooked because it's a little bit more about the structure. And so we know technology alone doesn't produce productivity. We can spend years building things in a lab, but unless you can get it outside of the lab into the field, things break down. So thinking about creative capital structures, like I've mentioned, founders need to think about different business models, different distribution. All of that is going to be critical in order to move the productivity forward. What worked in the past isn't going to work as we think about where is this new future going. Next slide, please. And so I think it's really important that we spend some time talking about how AI is going to change where productivity is coming from, because we're already seeing it and we're already seeing our founders use it. So there was a research report that came out a little while ago from the National Bureau of Economic Research, and they did a study with 6,000 executives across US, UK, Germany, and Australia. And it was all around the use of AI. And the results were that the average CEO is using AI for just 90 minutes a week. 89% report no productivity gain, and only 1 in 4 executives aren't using AI at all. And I think that's such a missed opportunity because when I think about the founders that we're talking to, they're using AI every day. It's ingrained into how they operate. They're seeing their work productivity move twice as fast, doing 55% more work than what they could before. And the ROI on the investment in AI infrastructure is a $3 to $10 payback for every dollar they're putting in. So founders using fleets of AI agents, automating accounting and workflow, invoice processing, grant compilation, regulatory compliance documentation, marketing, and autonomous commerce. All of this is the underlying backbone, I think, of where innovation is going. And there's this big disconnect between what's happening perhaps on the public corporate level and where startups are actually playing. And I think the ones that can lean into these AI tools are going to get to market faster at a more cost-effective rate. And the ability for them to do that means that their product is going to be in the hands of farmers and producers faster, and we're going to therefore see a greater increase in productivity overall because these products are coming to market in a way that's cost effective and in a more timely manner. So we know farmers and operators aren't buying AI, but the underlying tools to get to high yield, lower input costs, less labor, better decisions are all being driven by AI and where it's going. And so I think the companies that can build for this are going to be the ones that are building durable solutions and the ones that will ultimately outlast and drive where productivity comes from. Next slide, please. So I want to just close with kind of coalescing some of the things that we've talked about today. I think we know founders are actively building. The number of startups that we're seeing that are doing things in food and agriculture is not decreasing. The science exists. The question on the table is just really how do we design capital structures and policy in a way that allows these technologies to actually reach scale? So ultimately, we need to think about appropriate funding for early stage companies and technology. So whether that's SBIR and STR grants, whether that's state innovation matching dollars, land grant commercialization mandates, non-dilutive capital, farmer field trials, we just need to think about what is needed in order to move this technology out of the lab and into the hands of farmers. And it's not large involvement, or it's not large investments. Oftentimes it can be as simple as writing a small check to give that validity, give the company some runway, get that IP developed, and then we start seeing the productivity gains that will eventually show up in the data that Keith and Jessica presented. Second, I think we need clear, stable regulatory pathways. So regulatory uncertainty is a massive capital killer when rules around biotech crops, gene editing, data ownership, automation, when all of that's changing with each election cycle or on a monthly or quarterly basis, investors price that into our model, and we see some of the investors walking away from this category. It's not because the science is bad, but it's because the rules keep changing. And on the founder side, we see founders looking elsewhere to launch their products. So they may be a US startup, but they're looking to Latin America or Southeast Asia as their first market entry, which is not helping us drive US productivity. But they're going there because the regulatory pathways are faster, easier to navigate, and they can get their product to market faster. And lastly, I think it's really important that we think about replicating models that work. While we're just one example of bringing farmers and producers to the table and helping fund that early innovation, there's numerous others out there, whether it's farmer field trials, whether it's universities having really clear founder-friendly commercialization and tech transfer policies. Ultimately, we need to think about what's out there because we don't need to reinvent the model. We just need to replicate what's working and make it accessible across all of the different land grant universities and all facets of where we see these ag innovations. So productivity we see doesn't decline overnight, and I don't think it rebounds overnight either, but it does rebound if we can put the right structures, the right capital, and the right people at the table. So that is all I have for you. Thank you, Tim, and thank you the rest of the Farm Foundation for having me.
Thank you so much, Michaela. That was terrific. So we've got some really terrific questions. If the rest of our panelists want to come back on camera, and we'll have a great discussion here with some of these questions. I will take moderator's prerogative to ask the first question, and it's really about looking at the world today and all the changing relationships and alliances, and it makes me wonder which global power shifts are likely to reshape agricultural productivity over the next decade. Is it China? Is it India? BRICS, the global south? Is it energy-related politics or something else? Anybody want to take a stab at that one?
Well, I could start, Tim. I think the thing that I see most impressive in the global productivity landscape is the rise of China's investment in agricultural R&D and the decline in the United States investment in agricultural R&D. So I think in the future we'll see that the big advances are going to be things coming out of Asia that will be more appropriate for Asian agriculture. Some of that would be of benefit to the United States, but we would become more of a we'll be borrowing technology and not be on the frontier as we have been in the past. And I think what is really motivating that is countries don't want to be overly dependent on food from other countries. They want to be, especially large powers, want to be basically self-sufficient in their food staples. And so I think that's what's really been driving growth in places like China and India. They want to be self-reliant in food and energy, and this is how they can achieve that in food.
Great. Jessica, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I think I would add, I don't know if Andy Levine from ASTA is on the call, but we had a really interesting chat at Commodity Classic 2 weeks ago, just about, so right now we're reaping the the consequences of decisions made 10, 20 years ago. And so what does that mean 10, 20 years from now? So we're seeing the winners from, decisions that have been made in the last decade kind of come to the, in the markets and that TFP growth signal right now. So I guess, taking a step back, and especially for Farm Foundation as a leader of these discussions, to say, okay, what's coming 10, 20 years from now? And then building those collaboration ecosystems that, in working with Ag Startup Engine and the land grants, to say, what does strategic foresight look like when you're talking about bridges between public and private investment, and what's worked well for us in the past, and where do we have the opportunity to think a little differently kind of going forward for what's coming in the next 10, 20 years. So not a direct answer to your question, but I think if we want to see, the US kind of back at the forefront, what does that take today, and how, it'll take us some time to reap those outcomes. So.
Great, thank you. So jumping into the questions, the first was, does a lower rate of population growth in many parts of the world in and of itself explain any of the cooling happening around the growth around productivity?
No, I
So
don't
less
think
people, less
so.
production.
I would say, I mean, population growth, the impact of you know, new diet drugs and so forth, those are really demand side effects. So that can reduce the demand for food or the growth in the demand for food. But what the productivity slowdown is a supply side. So that's really being driven by the technologies and practices at the farm level.
Great. This is a question I think is really provocative. Isn't some reduction a good thing as we reduce food waste as well? And can we track that? Somebody want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I can jump in. So that's in the GAP report, we have five sort of investment and policy priorities, and reducing food loss and waste is one of them. Again, coming back to, I think we'd need a whole separate session for uh, our goals around output growth. I hear a lot, we produce enough food, we don't need to talk about output growth anymore, versus, the economics arguments around food prices. So I just think there are a lot of potential unintended consequences with trying to cool output growth. It's not a simple kind of straightforward explanation, but I do think there are opportunities to reduce food loss and waste, and that that does also have implications for food and nutrition security, especially on the types of foods that experience a lot of waste and where it's happening. So is it at the farm gate in many emerging economies? Is it at the consumer level in the home? I shamefully must admit that my vegetable my vegetable waste is not what it should be, knowing what I know. So there's a lot of complicated arguments there, but there are food price implications for reduction in output growth that we just need to consider how that affects many emerging economies and their rate of and import dependent nations on food security, but definitely an opportunity for food loss and waste reduction.
I've been
I mean,
thinking a lot as go ahead, please.
I just wanted to add to that. I think we need to be a little careful, though, about the potential to reduce food loss and waste. On the one hand, it seems like a no-brainer. I mean, 30% of what we produce doesn't actually get used; just gets thrown away or used, just for animal feed. I mean, can't we just save that, and that would seem to solve a lot of the global food issue. But in fact, in high-income countries, most food waste occurs in the home. And that, there's a lot of, I mean, Jessica just admitted it, right? I mean, it's built into, there's a lot of behavioral issues, a lot of just, how we live our lifestyles. It's not always clear how one adjusts and encourages changes in behavior that would reduce those losses. And stores and farms and so forth, the marketing system has big incentives to try to reduce that loss, because that's just money down the drain. And the reason that those losses occur is because it's very expensive to reduce those losses. And you have to make, if you're a company saying, do I spend $1 million to in new refrigeration systems or storage or transportation systems to save $100,000 in food losses? And so if it doesn't make economic sense, if it takes more resources to conserve that food, those decisions won't be made. So we have to be careful about it's not a low-hanging fruit to reduce those food losses.
Yeah, I don't think it's on an output. I think it comes down to the supply chain and the consumer side of like, it's not how do we reduce it on the farm here in the US, whereas that's the case, I think, in many other regions. It's how do we reduce it along the way from the farm to the consumer's plate.
Michaela, I think you talked about this a little bit, but if you want to go a little deeper, but can the aging farming population be a driving factor for the low adoption of innovation in the farming sector?
I think sometimes it can, because sometimes you've got this transition from, parents into the next generation. Maybe the next generation is a little bit more tech forward and they're more willing to adopt. So you're dealing with that. How do you convince someone who's done something for 60 years that this new way is better? And I think that's ultimately where it comes down to having that data around ROI, and it's on the founder and the new technology to be able to prove that this is de-risked enough for you to put it on your field. And what we see oftentimes I think this is perhaps maybe where there's a disconnect, because I think when startups come in and they're introducing a new technology to a farmer, it's not, I have a 500-acre field, I'm going to put it on all 500 acres. It's a gradual adoption rate to get up to that full scale adoption on a farm by farm level. And that ultimately just takes time and trust. And so you have a multi-year relationship before you get to perhaps what you would consider like full capacity within that customer. And I think sometimes those coming into agriculture, not from the agriculture industry, don't come in with that mindset and understanding. And that can create challenges and friction when, especially, you're dealing with a company that has investor dollars and that misalignment on timeline.
Jessica, I will aim this one at you. This is an interesting question. Are there substantial differences in TFP growth across different types of food, such as specialty crops of fruit and vegetables versus commodity crops?
That's a really good question. It might actually be better for Keith since he's the master of the data set, but it's a question we get often, and it's actually quite difficult to estimate total factor productivity growth by crop or livestock or aquaculture stream because of the way that you need to get the data around inputs and then outputs. So, I mean, outputs easy enough, but how do you attribute, certain inputs to certain products. So it is something that we have a goal around with the GAP initiative and collaborating with folks like Keith and the FAO, because we know that then that level of insight then helps investors, it helps universities know where we need to be channeling our innovation. And then it also ties back to the food and nutrition security story. So I think somebody had also asked a question around why can't we just like why do we need public R&D? Why can't we just use private since it seems to have better outcomes? And so I'll just take the opportunity to mention that private sector, especially if you're talking about, say, the big ag businesses, they're going to follow the market. So they're going to put their R&D dollars in corn and soy and cotton. And there's one other major commodity that kind of receives a bulk of the R&D dollars. But what about more nutrient dense crops? So you see right now, NASDA is looking at, what crop protection products and what specific productivity enhancing tools are needed to be on the market already in order to convince producers to maybe diversify into more nutrient dense foods. So they're really important questions. The data can be a bit challenging to disentangle, so I wouldn't be able to comment on a particular insight, but following sort of the market trends, we've reached some significant levels of productivity in the major commodities. And so trying to shift now into the more nutrient dense areas is really important in the R&D landscape as well.
Yeah, I just might add to that that
Good question.
what we see actually across commodities, and you can expect this. I mean, research is kind of an uncertain, risky undertaking. You can get breakthroughs, and then you can get periods of droughts, and then you get something else comes along. And so you might find there'll be a period in which a particular commodity will suddenly, will get a big productivity boost, and then it will kind of stagnate and something else will come up. So we see a lot of that churning going on across the agricultural sector. I don't think we could really say that there are certain commodities that always perform better in terms of productivity. It's really driven by that research and innovation and discovery process.
And I think the other challenge, just to expand on what Jessica was talking about with corporates, is oftentimes they have shareholders, they have quarterly milestones they have to hit. And sometimes this risky R&D funding or working with startups or investing outside of what their like top priorities are for this quarter or this year doesn't make sense. And so I think that creates a challenge that we can't just rely on only private capital to fill this gap. It's complementary, like Keith was saying, we need both at the table. Otherwise, we're just going to be stagnant.
So there's a question about a recent Anthropic analysis of AI capability and use by sector that puts food and agriculture at the bottom of the table. Is this realistic, or do they not understand the sector? Michaela, that one goes right to you.
I mean, I wouldn't be shocked. I think we talked to a lot of founders, and one of the first questions we started asking is like, what AI tools are you using? How are you thinking about integrating it? Just because it does have this tremendous impact on reducing costs. Like, I don't know if anyone here has played around with some of the AI tools, but the fact that you can spend 4 hours on a weekend and get an app built and have your working MVP, like that's a game changer from I used to have to outsource this to a developer, pay tens of thousands of dollars, and now I can just pay a couple $100 on some credits. And so I think the pace of which things can move is so much faster, which is why I think we have this massive opportunity, and those that do adopt it early are going to be able to reap the rewards. And so I'm not shocked that ag is trailing behind because I do feel like we're often one of the industries that receives technology last. And for all of the reasons that like we have to be cognizant of the risk. But to me, this is one where there's a lot of internal applications that it can be used for to just speed up how do we move innovation forward or how do we optimize for profitability or productivity.
I think too, we already had a trust problem with farmers around how we use their data, and now this is like a supercharged way of using their data. And so seeing a lot of concern amongst sort of maybe the mid part of this, the adoption curve. You've got your early adopters that are probably already building apps with Anthropic, and then you've got the rest of your curve that you can tell are just a little bit nervous about what's coming. And I think it's a communications challenge for us in the public sector and in the science, and just still a generic lack of understanding in the public sector and universities. And, with my colleagues, even I was talking to somebody the other day who said, if we use, Claude or ChatGPT to write proposals for grants, aren't we just all going to be writing the same proposal? No, that's not how it works. So, so there's something about, well, it's predictive modeling, therefore all of our proposals will be the same. But I mean, you can ask the same question twice and get totally different answers. So I think there's still just a general lack of understanding of what it is and how it works, and then combine that with this trust issue around how we're using farmer data. I think it makes sense that it's putting us in last place.
Well, I think there's two camps when it comes to the data. There's the founders that are like, we're training our own model on like it's just your data, you own the data, it's all yours. We're using public data sets to train our model. And then there's others that are saying we're using your data to train our model. And it'll be really interesting to see like which one wins, because I think right now farmers care, like I want to own my data. If I'm a farmer, I don't want to share it. I don't want everyone else to see it. And so we'll see if that changes in the coming months or years as these continue to roll out.
There's a lot of cooperatives being built right now for exactly that purpose, Michaela, to figure that out. Sticking on AI, Michaela, would you say that AI is probably the most important advancement for agriculture and productivity over the next decade, or is there another technology that you think is going to have a bigger impact on productivity?
No, I think it's AI. Like I think we're in this age where like we lived through the dot-com boom and we saw how the internet changed everything. I think we're entering this age where artificial general intelligence is like here or imminently here, and that's just going to transform how every industry operates, whether it's ag or just everything in our day-to-day lives.
I went to a Google Public Sector Summit in DC, and if you think you know what AI is, you don't know what's coming. And I felt like I was in the room when the internet was being created. I
Yeah.
mean, just the level of changes that are coming that these tech companies are investing in. And we are hearing about the bubble, but it's very similar to the dot-com area. We'll see a contraction and then we'll continue to see it grow. So it's not going anywhere. I will say I did a little bit of my own analysis on where the AI trends are emerging within the ag sector. And, about 60% are targeted, AI-driven solutions are targeted at the farm level, 30% sort of after farm level, so either agronomists, machine operators, and less than 5% are being targeted at decision makers or policy makers. And so that was a really interesting finding for me about the potential lopsidedness that we may have. So farmers have more insight about what's going on in their operations, but policymakers still continue to operate blind. And so that's, a small little plug for something we're working on, the GAP initiative called GAP IQ is trying to bridge that gap so that those who make decisions that affect agriculture have better insights while also trying to protect that producer experience and data.
That's great.
I mean, the other thing that I think that will have or could potentially have a big impact on productivity is the application of the new gene editing technologies in breeding of more resilient crops and livestock. This has opened up a huge opportunity for rapid improvement, sequential but rapid improvement in the genetics of crops and livestock. But it's going to be dependent on the regulatory frameworks that emerge to look at these technologies and to assess them for their environmental and health safetiness.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of that. So,
Keith, I'll stick with you on this question. If only 8% of the food dollar goes to primary producers like farmers, does that suggest that 92% of our opportunities lie further down the value chain? Or does the commodity price have a disproportionate impact on the system?
Well, the truth is actually, if we look at productivity in the agri-food system, productivity has really grown a lot historically in farm production, in agriculture. Productivity in the food processing sector has been rather slow. And there's been a lot of sort of new food products developed, but how much productivity gain do you get from the next brand of cereal? So the TFP growth rates in the food industry are relatively low. TFP growth rates in agriculture have been high. I mean, historically compared, they're similar to what we see in, say, in computers and in digital technologies. That it's historically been one of the fast productivity growth sectors of the economy. And so this slowdown that we see occurring now is really new, and it's very concerning. And I think it's true that lower commodity, if productivity lowers commodity prices because of the higher productivity, it may not have that big an impact on what consumers pay for food, because so much of what consumers pay is that value added, like you say. But for low income countries where the food dollar is very much tied to the price of staples coming off the farm, and where consumers are spending half or more of their income on those staples, being able to reduce the cost of food and commodities has a huge impact on their welfare and their ability to afford a healthy diet.
Related to that, what is the impact of the New World screwworm on productivity as it relates to food loss on the supply side? Jessica, do you want to try that one?
Oh, I've heard a lot about the New World's screwworm in the past couple weeks. I think that this is the point of the foresight and keeping an eye on risks that are coming, and then how does that affect our R&D pipelines. So, I mean, some things are impossible to predict, but looking at opportunities for our innovation and research ecosystem to be more agile. And part of the magic of the U.S. System is through the land grant universities that are meant to be able to surface these challenges that producers are facing by producers having direct relationships with researchers at the land grant universities. Each state, kind of varies in its, success and experience and trust with producers around that. But, conceptually, the model is very interesting. So how can we find ways to continue to innovate on that so that we can deploy agile resources to tackling these issues? Because again, remember, TFP tells us something about innovation in the ecosystem, and if farmers are able to adopt those technologies. So that's I don't personally know a lot about the screwworm other than it's causing some major problems.
Well, but it points to a broader issue, and this is again kind of a unique feature of agriculture, in that crops and livestock are raised in within an evolutionary environment, and those pests and diseases that affect those productivity are also evolving, and so we see a lot of agricultural research goes into what we call just maintenance research, or maintaining current levels of productivity. Because if we don't have that kind of research, then these new threats will start will take hold and start reducing productivity. And we've seen this with the orange industry in Florida has really just gotten wiped out from citrus greening disease. It was this introduced pest, and they didn't have in place uh, ways to control it. We see, avian flu, African swine fever is another potential threat that could have huge negative consequences on the swine industry if it would get introduced into the United States. So a lot of the research establishment is oriented toward trying to evaluate those threats and prepare for them.
Farm Foundation Roundtable Fellows recently visited the cattle border crossing at El Paso, Texas, a month ago. It was pretty alarming to see such a remarkable infrastructure set up to bring cattle back and forth between our two countries. To see that sitting idle with no ability to know when it may come up again. And they showed videos of in Brazil and Argentina in particular, where the problem is pretty steep. They showed us videos of the calves and cows affected by this disease, and it was remarkable. But yeah, I think we understand our cost of beef a little better from that visit. The next question says, Sub-Saharan Africa is projected to need to feed an additional billion people, and South Asia an additional 750 million. Many of these are being born into poverty and therefore hunger, but will experience rapid future growth if they enjoy economic growth. Relatively high income in East Asia and Europe are losing population. So please comment on the role of research in changing dynamic global food supply and demand balance between now and 2075, when we will reach our maximum global population. And it was recommended that Keith take this one.
Well, let me first talk about Africa. I think this is what I'm most concerned about in terms of looking at the ability of the world to reduce hunger and food insecurity, because this is an area where there's been relatively little investment in agricultural research, where there's been relatively little growth in productivity over the past decades, and where population is growing still at a very rapid rate. And so this is, Africa has, if you look on paper, lots of good land. It should be able to grow a lot of food, but it's having to import a lot of its food, and many people simply cannot afford even a basic 2,000 calorie a day diet. So there is a real need for an agricultural revolution to take hold in Africa, and there's a real need to increase investment in agricultural research. The United States actually, through its foreign aid programs, through its university, what they called innovation labs, and through its support of the international research centers, has made major contributions to improving food security and raising productivity in both Africa and Asia, including South Asia. But it hasn't been enough to really turn that tide in Africa. Now in South Asia, I think actually it's a different story. I mean, there's lots of poor people there, but there's a lot of also economic growth. There's a lot of investment in research. I'm much more positive about the future of South Asia being able to feed its population and moving people out of poverty. I mean, the changes that I've seen occur in Bangladesh have been so impressive. I mean, back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, this was one of the most densely populated countries in the world. People were just writing it off. It was one of the poorest countries of the world, most dependent on food aid. It had an agricultural revolution that really raised productivity, developed the whole aquaculture industry, and it's now moved into, it's not a low income country anymore. It's called a lower middle income country. You have and you've had huge reductions in child malnutrition and in poverty rates, and you have that agricultural revolution. What happens is that when you have rising incomes from agriculture, from higher agricultural productivity, it actually serves to reduce the birth rates. And so you get a positive gain from that, that then further stimulates economic growth, what we call a demographic dividend. We haven't seen that take place in Africa yet, so that's why I'm very concerned about what's going on there. But I'm much more positive about South Asia.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
Well, just to go back to the AI revolution that's coming, I was talking to an investor and they told me, yeah, we just draw a big X through Africa because we just don't have the data. Like there's no way to get data that would uh, allow our investors to feel secure enough to make these investments. Now, there's differing opinions. There are investment dollars moving in Africa. But one thing we've actually been working on in the College of Ag and Life Sciences with the African Development Bank is around, what are the innovations, that are going on that would facilitate large scale data capture, remote sensing, satellite imagery, IoT sensors, sort of running the gambit right now of ways of collecting that data. And then how can we use that and use AI, not about, I hear a lot in Africa about getting extension information to farmers through AI, which I am slightly concerned about, if I'm being honest. But kind of coming out of that, again, the AI and data value chains to decision makers, so that we have more granular insights where our early stage investment is going to be most successful when you're talking about an entirely different type of farming ecosystem. And what ultimately is the goal? Are we trying to, we've been trying for decades to achieve structural transformation, reducing the number of smallholder farmers, creating some consolidation that just hasn't been successful in the way that, the World Bank imagined that it would be. So what's our end goal? Is it to make smallholder farming a viable enterprise? Or are we trying to, move those who are, well equipped to become more medium scale producers? Because that's also going to tell us something about the type of innovation that we need, the type of technological transformation practices and innovation. It doesn't really work to just like go in and drop our model, that where it has worked for us in other places. So I think there's some interesting questions in the productivity story. We can take a step back and look at, what's available to us and how to maybe reframe the way we've been approaching it.
Related to that data question, we have a question from one of our current ag scholars. And he asks, when it comes to data collection and aggregation, do producers tend to trust universities or public institutions more with their data than with private sector?
No. It depends on the farmer. I think, yeah, like I've heard all kinds of things. I've actually even heard, within the Virginia Tech, ag experiment station, farmers prefer to work with graduate students than our researchers because the researchers come in sort of know-it-all energy. So even they trust graduate students because they think they're so keen and they're gonna, be really protective of data and follow all the rules where they view researchers as being too laissez-faire. So I think there's definitely a spectrum, but it's still a challenge for us in the public sector and universities as well. I haven't worked in the private sector, so I don't have a point of comparison, but it is still a huge concern.
Well, I spent about 25 years with one of the federal statistical agencies, the Economic Research Service. And I think that generally, I mean, the USDA does a really excellent job in protecting the privacy of data. And I think that by and large, farmers have confidence in that. They've seen that maintained over the years. But nonetheless, the USDA is also suffering from lower response rates to its surveys. And I think a big reason is, I mean, it's burdensome to fill out all those questionnaires, and the government, we had, the Paperwork Reduction Act, that really tries to reduce the burdens of government data collection on households and businesses. But it does involve a lot of costs, and when farmers get these big surveys, I can understand why they get tired of filling them out. And it's a big challenge to how we can make sure we still have valid data and up-to-date data on what's going on in the economy.
Miguel, there was a question comparing total productivity growth around germplasm and seed innovation compared to the impacts of other ag tech like drones and things like that. And so the question was, is it really worth investing in some of these things that have not been able to show a measurable impact on productivity? And should we be investing more, as Dr. Fugly recommended, around CRISPR and other technologies similar to that?
Yeah, I know, Jessica, when you were talking, we were talking about like the varieties and how we've seen kind of a reduction in like the impact. And I think you see that with any new technology. You first introduce it, you're going to see all these gains, and then they start to kind of fizzle out. And some of that I think is driven by some of the environmental concerns. We're dealing with new pests, new diseases, and the previous genetics maybe weren't equipped to deal with it, or there's been resistance that has been built up. And so I still think like it's worth, I do think we need to allocate investment dollars there, both public and private. I think we just need to understand that it's a longer time horizon. And this comes back to some of the things I was mentioning about how do we reduce some of the regulatory burden. And I'm not saying we necessarily need to make it like we're not wanting to put things out there that are not safe, but like how do we streamline that process? How do we make it easier for founders and new technologies to navigate that? Because right now what we're seeing is a lot of them are going elsewhere to do some of these early trials or enter markets. And so that technology is going to come to market first, whether it's Brazil or Southeast Asia, instead of coming to the US first. And so there's a lot of activity happening around new traits, new varieties, new inputs, but it's not all we're not reaping all the rewards here in the US.
One thing I wanted to say on the data, we're seeing a lot in the private sector in terms of incentivizing data sharing cooperation with farmers as a means of providing another stream of income. And there are a lot more safeguards being built into that system to protect unique farmer indicators and things like that. And I think that's an encouraging trend. And, I think thinking of data as being another diversification opportunity for farms is a really important one. So I think there are good things out there happening in that regard, but I agree with Keith. Farmer trust and fatigue for these things is real, and so it really does become incumbent on those trusted service and advice providers to really help farmers through that process and ensure, that income stream is sort of in the long-term best interest of their farm. But I think anything at this point that we can do to support farmers and bring some more value back is so important. There was a question about labor, and it says TFP growth, as described, does not include labor, both farm labor and agribusiness managers or research scientists. How does our reduction in land-grant ag college graduates, undergrad and graduate, impact TFP growth?
Well, the TFP growth or productivity growth, the increase in the quality of the labor force is one source of productivity growth. And so if we have more, say, college educated people working in agriculture, that generally makes a positive contribution to productivity, as it does in other sectors. Now, agriculture is a little unique in that overall, the quality of the labor force, the educational attainment of the labor force has been increasing, but we also have a large segment of the population that's relatively low education. A lot of the contract labor for fruit picking and so forth, I mean, they're skilled labor, but relatively low education and low wage jobs. And so those aren't jobs that will attract a lot of college educated people. So our productivity statistics do account for both the changing quantity and quality of that labor force. Now, what we don't include is, like I think that the questionnaire may have been referring to, is say the scientific workforce, that's generating those technologies, and the decline in, or if there is a decline in the number of, say, PhD scientists working in agriculture. And we've certainly seen about a 30% decline in, we talked about the decline in funding. Well, that's equivalent to a 30% decline in the number of scientists working in the public agricultural research system at the state universities and USDA labs. So there's fewer scientists working on these problems, even as the economy has grown, the agricultural economy has grown and become a larger sector.
Yeah, I have a
think too. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, go for it, Jessica.
Oh, I was just going to say, so it's not just about universities. It's, almost as close to a universal truth as one can be, is that farmers learn from each other, and the peer-to-peer learning is absolutely essential in how knowledge and those improved practices disseminate through a producer group. So I haven't studied this, but I'm just generally interested in how the role of technology is maybe displacing some of that peer-to-peer learning. Especially when we talked earlier about the demographics, you still have a number of farmers that are older, and so they still want to learn through social relationships, and then younger farmers who are doing more with tech. I don't have an answer necessarily, but just that does play a really critical role, especially as new priorities and agendas are coming online, such as the regen ag and the soil health discussions. Even just being at Commodity Classic was so interesting to hear what some farmers are talking about on the panels versus, what they're talking about in the seats or around the lunch table. A lot of skepticism or, lack of clarity about what practices are appropriate for them. So that peer-to-peer learning and its interaction with technology, I think, is also really important part of the story.
I don't have an answer either, but a couple data points that I think are interesting. So my counterpart at Ag Startup Engine runs the entrepreneurship programs at Iowa State in the College of Ag and teaches a class around ag entrepreneurship. And one of the interesting things over the last few years, the number of students that have gone through that class that then want to go back to the farm and work has dramatically increased. And so I think we're seeing a lot of young people wanting to go back to the farm, but also recognizing there's maybe not a full-time role. So I need to go back to the farm, but also have another side business that I'm doing. And then I think the other interesting thing that I've seen on the labor side is there's a lot of companies that are now foregoing almost partnering with universities and launching their own training programs. So instead of having to go get a 4-year degree, you go through our training program, graduate in 8 months, and we're paying you while you do it, and you're locked into a 3 to 4-year job. And so I think we're seeing this dramatic change, and that will continue over the next coming years of what does education look like, specifically from peer-to-peer learning, and can you build the infrastructure yourself, and can you do it faster?
Interesting.
Well, I think we will wrap it up right there. A very sincere thank you to Keith, Jessica, and Michaela for your time and your efforts and your incredible wisdom on this topic. Really a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much. And thank you too to our audience. What a vibrant and interesting Q&A session. So thank you so much for your inputs and your ideas. We really appreciate your engagement with us. We'd love to hear your feedback. So please take a moment to share your comments about today's session in a survey that you'll see at the conclusion of this forum. And once again, we'll ask if you enjoyed this session to please support our work. We'll drop the link again in the chat for you now. And just a quick reminder that our Farm Path info session will be on Thursday if you're interested in that. So once again, thank you all for joining us today. This will now conclude our forum.